So let's say it's fall. It's October. Halloween is rapidly approaching, and you decide, you know what, I need to go and get a pumpkin from the pumpkin patch. So you go and you pick out your pumpkins, and then you start feeling a little sick. Scratchy throat, a bit of a headache, you feel warm, and you have a really runny nose. And you're thinking to yourself, oh man, am I getting sick now, right before Halloween? And so you go into your doctor and, explain everything that's going on. And your doctor tells you that it's probably hay fever, an allergic reaction to pollen in the air. But what actually are allergies, and why do they affect so many of us? Well, let's talk about the science behind that.
Welcome to The Science Behind That with Atticus Hamilton.
Hello, you scientists. Welcome on back to The Science Behind That podcast. I'm your host, Atticus Hamilton. And as you heard from the intro, we're going to be talking today about the science behind allergies. So this episode idea came to me because I was talking to somebody and she said that she was allergic to Christmas trees. And I thought that was really interesting. I had never heard of that before, and then it made me start thinking, maybe other people out there, maybe people out there would like to know about the science behind allergies and how that works. So allergies are purely a result of our immune system basically freaking out for no reason. But before we jump into the meat and potatoes of today's episode, I'd like to invite all of you to go grab yourselves a nice hot cup of coffee, add a little bit of maple syrup to it, and we'll jump right in. All right, now that we're all caffeinated, allergies. So I've talked about the immune system many different times on this show, and for those of you that have seen my other episodes or just know a little bit about immunology, you'll know that there are three different types of immunity. There's innate immunity, there's passive immunity, and there's active immunity. Innate immunity is like your skin forms a barrier against infection. Passive or non-adaptive immunity is what we're going to be talking about today, which these are cells that are called leukocytes, and leukocytes, they just go around and eat things, basically. So you have macrophages or leukocytes, neutrophils are leukocytes. They're also called polymorphic nuclear leukocytes. Mast cells, eosinophils, basophils, those are all leukocytes. And they all serve a very important role in fighting different organisms or different things, but they are all part of passive immunity, or non-adaptive immunity. Now, adaptive immunity are things like your T cells and your B cells. B cells, they produce antibodies and they remember antibodies, and T cells will use the information provided to them in the form of antigens and antibodies to basically hunt down their cellular targets. So there's a whole process of creating killer T cells and cytotoxic T cells, and it involves displaying crushed up antigen, basically, which is usually your pathogen, on the surface of a protein called MHC class 1 and MHC class 2 on the surface of macrophages, and it basically presents it to the T cell to say, this is what you're looking for. It's like the fingerprint of the pathogen, and then the T cell goes to look for the fingerprint of that pathogen, to look for those antigens. So they function a little differently than like B cells do in terms of producing antibodies, but they are still active, meaning that they are specific, right? So passive immune system, macrophages, neutrophils, that's your non-specific immune response. Basically, they'll just eat anything that they think is a pathogen. Whereas B cells and T cells are very specific. So if you have COVID, they go after COVID. If you have influenza, they go after influenza. That sort of thing. So, for the purpose of allergies, then, you're not looking at a specific immune response necessarily. You're looking at your non-specific immune response. Because here's the thing, too. With the specific immune response, or the active or adaptive immune response, with the B cells and the T cells, there is a lag period. And it's a couple days usually. And why is there a lag period of a couple days? Because the B cells have to figure out, and I know I'm personifying it, but they have to figure out what antigen to produce that's effective against the pathogen. So when it comes to allergies, because the allergen isn't replicating inside of you, very rarely does it progress to an adaptive immune response. Now it can, and in certain situations like that, where it causes a very severe immune response, that's called anaphylactic shock, which is a severe allergic reaction, which we can talk about a little later. But in most people that don't have severe allergic reactions to things like that, it generally remains in the realm of the mast cells and the basophils and the eosinophils. And all three of those are part of the passive immune system, or the non-adaptive immune response. So, let's talk about that. So, what is an allergy or an allergen? Well, an allergen is simply defined as something that stimulates an immune reaction, an immune response. So for things like hay fever, it's pollen. Specifically for hay fever, it's the pollen of the ragweed plant, and that causes pretty severe allergies for a lot of people. But, in the springtime, it's just generalized pollen from the trees and the grasses as they reproduce. But people can be allergic to shellfish as well. And so basically all an allergen is, or an antigen is it's something that stimulates an immune response. And usually allergens specifically stimulate the action of basophils and eosinophils. So eosinophils produce an antibody called IgE. And IgE is a generalized antibody. It's not a specific antibody for a specific pathogen like B cells produce, but IgE is produced by eosinophils in response to parasites and in response to allergies. And so when someone who is allergic to, let's say, ragweed, for example, comes across ragweed pollen, their eyes will start getting itchy, their nose will get itchy, blah, blah, blah. That's because of three things happening. First, mast cells so first the pollen goes up the nose, right? And mast cells identify these pollen particles and they eat them. And when they eat them, the mast cells are like, oh man, there's a pathogen here. We gotta alert the immune system. So they release this very specific group of molecules called cytokines, and they will release basophil stimulatory and eosinophil stimulatory specific cytokines. But they'll eat the pollen, they'll release the cytokines, and then it'll cause the basophils to come on site to where the pollen is. And then the basophils will eat pollen, and the basophils will be like, oh man, there is a pathogen here. We gotta raise our DEFCON threat level, and they will produce more cytokines. But the cytokines the basophils will produce will produce histamines, right? It will stimulate the release of histamines, and histamines are the compounds that cause that itchiness, the runny nose, the congestion. That is caused by histamines. And then after that happens, once the histamines are released, then that'll stimulate the eosinophils to come on site, and instead of being a phagocytic cell where they eat something, the eosinophils will just produce IgE to block up the pollen, which won't do anything because IgE as an antibody is designed to do two things. Number one, it's designed to immobilize a parasitic agent, okay? So it's designed to, like, if somebody has Giardia, eosinophils will be released to the gastrointestinal tract where the Giardia is, and they will release IgE, and the IgE will bind up the Giardia. It will surround it. It will basically solvate it. It will just completely saturate the Giardia with IgE antibodies, and that'll serve two purposes. Number one, it a lot of times kills the Giardia because it interferes with their metabolic function. And number two is it signals to mast cells and macrophages to come over here and eat this guy, grind up its the antigen and display it on MHC class 1 and 2 to your T cells. That's the purpose of that. And it'll display that to your B cells as well, because B cells need to connect to MHC class 1, if I remember correctly, to identify what a pathogen is. But that's the purpose of IgE. The purpose of IgE is basically like a homing beacon. It's like a tracker dart. If you've ever played the game Hunt Showdown, you know, where you can, like, I don't know, it gives you a perk where you can see poisoned enemies, and if you poison an enemy, you can see them in the dark site wherever they are on the map. Similar idea with this, in that it alerts the immune system to a pathogen. It alerts the immune system to this type of pathogen, being either a parasite or an allergen, and it allows the adaptive immune response to start, because it shows the antigen to the B cells and then the macrophages, which will show it to the T cells. So ultimately, when we're talking about generalized allergen response, that's what's happening, is your mast cells, your basophils, and your eosinophils are coming onto the scene, and they're thinking that the pollen is a pathogenic threat. But for the most part, the reason why it doesn't progress to, like, why you don't develop immunity to it is because the adaptive immune response never gets involved directly, because it's not replicating. Pollen doesn't replicate inside of you, right? It's like several short-term exposures that are very localized as opposed to systemic. So because of it, there's not enough levels of pollen within you or within the person to cause an adaptive immune response. Now, the question becomes then, you know, what are the trends looking like? Because on social media, you'll have a bunch of people say, oh, allergens are getting worse, and it's because our kids play video games all day, and blah, 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 right? So what actually is the allergen trend data? Well, the actual data is true in that industrialized nations, there is an increase in allergies, both as a result of pollen and then autoimmune disorders like Crohn's disease or irritable bowel syndrome or something like that, alopecia. But overall, the rise in the prevalence of allergies in industrialized countries has continued. And they theorize that pretty soon the worldwide rates to very common allergies are reaching around 40 to 50% in school-aged children. So a large percentage of school-aged children are or have allergies. In 2021, surveys have indicated that 25.7% of adults aged 18 to 44 have reported having seasonal allergies, and that is up from the previous year. So allergies amongst industrialized societies are increasing. And the question becomes why, right? Now, there's a lot of theories of why that is. But when you look at the data, a lot of times what you see is, especially with autoimmune diseases are far more prevalent in countries that are industrialized with modern medicine than they are in third world countries. Now, why is that? Well, people have argued that third world countries are more likely to die before you develop an allergy, which I don't necessarily agree with, because a lot of children develop childhood allergies. But the other argument, which I kind of favor too, is that in third world countries, there's more exposure to diseases, and specifically parasitic diseases. The immune system needs a target, right? The immune system is like a highly trained, decorated soldier with combat training, and that it needs a target, otherwise it may go a little stir crazy. And what we know for a fact is that autoimmune diseases have been shown that they can be reversed with intentional infection with parasites. Now, I'm not advocating for that, but there have been numerous studies that have shown that people who have gluten intolerance, I'm not talking celiac disease, I'm talking an allergy to gluten, like a gluten intolerance, or Crohn's disease or IBS. There have been numerous studies that have shown that intentional infection with hookworm has helped reduce those symptoms. Why? Well, because the immune system is fighting the hookworm. And so the data suggests that the immune system really needs an active target to pursue, and that habitual exposure to diseases is actually a good thing, as long as we're talking benign diseases, colds, flu, that sort of thing. But the data has indicated that constant exposure or repeated exposure to these harmless diseases is actually a good thing, because it trains the immune system and it minimizes the likelihood or the risk of chronic diseases appearing. Now, what does that mean with regular allergies? People don't really know. Now, there's a lot of theories as well that, allergies increasing in industrialized nations specifically could be as a result of change in diet or pesticides or whatnot. But there is definitely something to be said for the disease exposure. Personally, I don't have any allergies. I had a very mild allergy to pine sap when I was a kid, but these days, as an adult, I don't really have any allergies at all. Now, why I don't but my sister does, or why I don't but a lot of my friends do, I'm not really sure. And frankly, I don't know if the worldwide community as a whole knows why. However, the fact remains that allergies are still very similar to chronic autoimmune diseases, where the immune system is freaking out, and instead of attacking oneself, it just attacks pollen or a benign allergen. Now, the final part of this that I wanted to talk about, that I said we would, is anaphylactic shock and anaphylaxis. Why do some people have strong anaphylaxis where others don't? And what actually is it? Well, starting with the why, we don't really know why. There's a lot of theories that suggest that part of it may be that repeated exposure to something like peanut butter or bee stings or whatever in certain individuals with predispositions sort of compounds on itself and makes it more and more likely that anaphylaxis will occur and makes the immune response to those harmful things stronger. But there's no real definitive answers of why it happens conclusively. However, what it is pretty easy. What it is the exact same pathway of regular allergic reactions I talked to you before about, however, magnified by 10. Basically, what happens is the same thing I talked to y'all before about, where mast cells and basophils and eosinophils diffuse to the site of the allergen exposure, and they produce IgE and histamine. But what happens when they produce histamine is the production of histamine is magnified, and it becomes far more greater than it would be in a person with a normal allergic response or with a minimal allergic response. And it causes a compounding effect where the more histamine is secreted, it triggers more cells, more basophils, and more body tissues to produce more histamine, causing a histamine storm. Now, for some of you, that may sound familiar because in the past, we've talked about acute respiratory distress syndrome, and we've also talked about things like rhabdomyolysis causing a cytokine storm. Histamine storms and cytokine storms are very similar, where they, for the most part, they stem from a complete overreaction of the body's immune system. And just like in a cytokine storm where it can trigger a whole host of issues and organ failure, histamine storms can cause a very similar set of severe reactions. It's just the methodology and the physiology behind it is slightly different. But ultimately, nothing really special is happening here other than the immune system is not just reacting allergically to something, it is reacting extremely viscerally to an allergen where it may not in other people. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, that is all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of The Science Behind That podcast. If you have any questions or comments about the show and you have any suggestions, you can either send me a text using the link below, or you can send me an email to my email at thesciencebt@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to read them. My obligatory disclaimers for YouTube. My degree is in medical microbiology. I am a certified personal trainer and a certified nutritionist. For the context of this episode talking about allergies, I've had several hours of vigorous training in immunology for my degree. And I do consider myself to be decently knowledgeable about this topic. That being said, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate you listening to today's episode. I hope you guys have a great week. I'll see you on Friday. And remember, as always, ladies and gentlemen, stand up and question everything.